Hello, this is Elizabeth. I am the Catholic lady, and we're reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. We're on chapter 41, and at this point there will be notations of scripture included. So when we reach those points, I'll note those and continue. Chapter 41. Through the lonely years of Tarsus, it had come to Saul slowly and inevitably, as the patient falling of rain, that his mission was to the Gentiles. 1,000 times he had rejected the conviction. There were other evangelists, other missionaries, though it was to be admitted that their work among the Gentiles had borne but rare rewards, and few there were among the converted. The Jews would not listen to him, Saul ben Hillel, distrusting him, and the Jewish Nazarenes had similar aversions. They listened to the missionaries and evangelists, but not to him. It was Barnabas who had known nothing of the slow, only half-comprehended revelations to Saul over those 4 years of exile, who had told him, "You are to teach and convert the Gentiles. That is your mission, and that is why our fellow Jews, under mysterious promptings, will have naught to do with you. God, blessed be his name, knows what is necessary." Barnabas added, "The ways and the customs and the thoughts of the Gentiles are not familiar to me, but as a Jew of modest life and quiet existence and narrow knowledge, as they are to you, Saul. Therefore I have difficulty in speaking to them in terms they can understand, and in metaphors congenial to their spirits, and in language familiar to them. I can speak and be comprehended by our fellow Jews, especially the humble and the devout." He did not add that Saul's natural impatience and erudition and learning made it almost impossible for him to speak to those humble ones of little worldly knowledge. He was too easily inflamed. "But you are a learned man of Greek and Roman understanding, as well as a Pharisee Jew, and the Gentiles will listen to you as they will not listen to me, and others like myself. More and more do I understand why and how God chose you, Saul ben Hillel. How wondrous are his ways." Saul had never been in Antioch of Syria before, the birthplace of Lucanus, who would accompany him and Barnabas on frequent occasions. "My adoptive father," Lucanus had said with affectionate smile, "loathed the city, called it a pestilential den, stinking with urine and gutters, and rotted fruit, and goats, and camels, and asses, and unwashed hides of men and beasts. It was also too fervent, too hot, too alien to his Roman spirit. He had been sent there as a legate, and despised every moment of what he called his exile. He was an able administrator, the noble Diodorus Cyranus, and a firm old Roman, and a patriot, and a soldier above all, and adored the old gods and obeyed them, and was a man of justice and honor. For that he was respected by the inhabitants of Antioch, though hated by the tax gatherers, and not understood by the people of the city. To him, a matter was wholly right or wholly wrong, according to the law of old Rome. He was an anachronism in a world of hot confusion and a multitude of warring tongues. He had a simplicity and purity of nature not to be comprehended by men of compromise and venality. Alas, the world is poorer that he died, and the world will grow poorer through the years that his kind is known no more. "Surely God will raise up other generations like him," said Saul. Lucanus shook his head. "Who knows? Rome is dying, and all the spirit of Rome." Though Saul, in his life, had been given to deprecating men's opinions and impressions of the world, is too subjective, he found, to his dismay, that Antioch was somewhat worse than Lucanus had described, and he sympathized with the Roman legate Diodorus Cyranus. The Romans, of course, was as ubiquitous there as they were in Israel. Their swarming bureaucrats were equally obnoxious. Everything was regulated, supervised, ordered, and meanly inspected by those bureaucrats, and their minute records, as Lucanus ruefully remarked, kept account of every man's defecations and every new tunic or animal. They had buildings heaped with orderly records, and the bureaucrats toiled among them like ants. To them, men were not men. They were sheets of parchment, a number in a book. Imperial nations, said Lucanus, become cumbersome and weighty, and finally fall under the sheer massiveness of their regulations. When a nation no longer has respect for individuals, but only for masses, its day is done. He smiled his cold Grecian smile. That is what my father always declared, and he was correct. We have the Roman bureaucrats in Israel also, said Saul. However, they are cautious not to trespass too far. We are a people of temper. The people of Antioch prefer to brawl, feast, and lie with women, said Lucanus, and his smile broadened somewhat as he regarded Saul. Therefore, they do not openly fight the tax gatherers and other bureaucrats. It's a game. They choose, rather, to outwit them, and I find it a gayer custom. He had encountered Saul but twice before, and on each occasion he had seen a different vivid aspect of him. And since his visit to Tarsus, Saul had often baffled him by the presentation of still other aspects, many of them contrary to those once glimpsed. There was a protean quality to this man, apparently bold and courageous, and open, though he appeared, and without dissemblance. Leonine in appearance and in character, he was yet subtle and versatile, changeful and the same. In comparison with the merry and simple Barnabas, he was like a strong man beside an amiable and tender child. It was apparent that he loved Barnabas, but often when the three would be conversing together, and Barnabas made an artless remark, Saul did not appreciate the artlessness, as did Lucanus, and accept it as evidence of a gentle and crystalline nature. He would frown in quick irritability, which wounded Barnabas. Seeing then that he had hurt his friend, Saul would immediately contrite, but he would change the subject hastily, as if he thought the matter too obtuse for Barnabas, which further wounded the latter. The three, so dissimilar in all things, were bound together with bonds stronger than flesh and blood, or mere friendship, or human affection. The bonds were invisible, but they were as mighty as rock and iron. They were evidence of a love greater than man's, and a faith more invincible than death. They lived and had their being in the Messiah. As Saul was to write in a letter later, he also said, "To me, to live is Christ. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Galatians 2:20. Therefore Lucanus and Barnabas were, to Saul, not men separate from himself, but men inextricably joined with himself in love and salvation of God. So they regarded him also. To these men, others who did not believe, so deserved their tears, prayers, and compassion. For did they not live in a darkness from which God intended them to be rescued? For the first time, and in Antioch, were Nazarenes called Christians, and they were so named by the bantering Greeks, for the word Christus in Greek means anointed. The name was given not always with respect, but sometimes with Greek humor, for they considered the Nazarenes took themselves and their mission too seriously, and Greeks regarded the gods as beautiful symbols when they regarded them at all, and at the worst they considered them not only non-existent but risible. As the Nazarenes in Antioch, as elsewhere, seemed concerned only with an everlasting life beyond the grave, and anxiously sought to draw others to them below the crucifix, a dire symbol in itself, and did not appear to be happy in the way of ordinary men, and did not sensually pursue pleasure and beauty. The Greeks either pitied them as men without the capacity for enjoyment and delight, or impatiently shrugged and left them. Moreover, they were almost invariably Jews, and the Jews had a reputation for staring beyond the limits of the world and contemplating God, a dreary occupation. With the same attitude, and with somewhat less tolerance, the pragmatic Romans also regarded the Christians. They, to the Romans, had but one virtue. They paid their taxes in full, as astonishing phenomenon which even Romans did not practice. Beyond the puzzling virtue, they seemed passive, too gentle, too peaceful, to not only the Romans, but to the myriad of races in Antioch, including the Persians, Syrians, Egyptians, and Hindus, and thousands of dark-skinned, fierce-featured men of unknown desert tribes, and to barbarians. True, there were not many Nazarenes or Christians in Antioch, but in some incredible manner, they also seemed to be everywhere at once, inoffensive but insistent, lovingly insistent, and concerned not with themselves or trade or gain or feastings or laughter, but with unworldly matters too bizarre and strange for the mind of a sensible man to understand. Their very inoffensiveness, their very soft and tentative smiles, annoyed those about them. Therefore, they were often publicly insulted, or cheated openly in their poor little shops, or exploited in many other ways. A slave, who was also a Christian, served with eager humility, thus earning the detestation of fellow slaves and the greater contempt of the master. It was known that a man might impetuously strike a Christian, and the wretch would not even defend himself. But the gentle water was beginning, in some slight measure, to make a matrix in the stone of humanity. To this eastern city, this lusty, noisy, clamorous, dirty, and heated city, had come Saul of Tarsus to inspire and encourage the infant church. He was something new to the Romans and to the Greeks. He was a Jew with an impetuous aspect, contained but visible, a man of hauteur and pride and impatience, and with a blazing blue glance, beardless, emanating a mysterious strength. And he was not a man of the lowly places, but a man of learning, and riches, and power, and urban confidence. His mane of red hair, now streaked with gray, commanded attention, as did his manner and his voice. There was something military about him in his abrupt gestures and in his assurance. It was rumored that he was a tent maker and a weaver of goat's hair, something which the Romans rejected as absurd, and as did the Greeks. Here was a man neither meek nor mild, a man who would not retreat a foot from another aggressive man, a man who could roar, a man capable of his own violence of speech and act. He was a Christian, but of a certainty, not the sort of Christian extant in Antioch. The Romans and others were not the only ones of this opinion. The Christians discovered this for themselves also, and not with entire happiness. He came to the young church at Antioch, that urinous city, that motley city of thieves and wayfarers and rascals and riches and slaves and opulence, as filthy as it was uproarious. It was evident that he intended to take charge of the church, and not merely to preach. It was first in Antioch that he said to the Christian community, "Though you have countless guides in Christ, you do not have many fathers. For I became your father in Christ Jesus through the gospel. I urge you then, be imitators of me. What do you wish? Shall I come to you with a rod, or with love in a spirit of gentleness? 1 Corinthians 4:15-21. His first quarrel was with the community came as the result of his insistence that Gentile converts need not become Jews to accept Christ. The Jewish Christians, vastly in the majority, were vocally outraged and in the presence of Gentiles who were drawn to them. To these Gentiles, Saul said, I wish those who unsettle you would mutilate themselves. He was not less sarcastic to those Christians who insisted that to be a true follower of the Christ, one must live as meekly and as inoffensively as a slave. For as he later often and furiously repeated, you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if a man makes slaves of you, or preys upon you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To Saul, many of the Christians of Antioch were even more exasperating than some of the Nazarenes of Jerusalem. Too, the elders of the church were offended by his short manner of disposing of their dissensions and intense scrupulosities. Young though the church was, it was already beset by multitude of interpreters who shouted that they received divine inspiration and their opinions must be accepted or the offender suffer hellfire. Saul attacked these with a passion as devastating as it was ruthless. He said to Lucanus on the eve of the Greeks' departure for Philippi, in Jerusalem, many of the earlier Nazarenes were of distinguished families and learning and education and erudition, men of travel and intellectual stature. But in Antioch, we draw but the simple and illiterate and the dully obstinate. Lucanus had much more experience than Saul with the ignorant and humble, and knew more than did Saul that once these were given a petty authority, they were more arrogant than a man born to great authority. He was also more compassionate, though less inclined to uncritical love. When Saul roared, alone with his friends in their miserable little rooms in a poor inn, Lucanus said, speak more gently, with more conciliation, my Saul, and more slowly, in less learned terms. The humble mind is easily offended and fragile, and inclined to unreasonable rages, and does not follow an intricate and rapid argument. Rather, it resents and derides the speaker because it does not understand him. Speak as if to an unlettered children, in simple language and with less haste. It was rumored among the Christians that Saul and Lucanus were men of considerable riches. Why then did they live so meagerly? Lucanus was a Greek and a Gentile, and Gentiles were often incomprehensible. But Saul was not only a Jew, but a Pharisee. Therefore he baffled the other Christians. It was known that both men gave lavishly of their money to the young church and sent tithes to the church in Israel, which was doubtless exemplary. But the charity of Saul did not excite affection among the Christians, nor gratitude. They had a communal society, did they not, where every man shared with the brother, and were not the poor, by the mere fact that they existed, entitled to the treasures of a rich man, earned or unearned? They believed this in all righteousness, though it was contrary to the teachings of some of the elders. They took umbrage when Saul shouted at them as he shouted before, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. The Christians of Antioch, however, were less inclined to sit and wait for the imminent arrival of the Messiah, and were more inclined to earn their bread. As for Lucanus, they were awed by him and his cool and aloof manner, for he was a stranger. Many of the Jewish Christians still harbored a conviction that a Gentile was to be treated with restraint and some wariness, even if he was a Christian too. Respect, but suspect, their simple forefathers had said of the Gentiles, and those descended of them were inclined to agree still. The few Greeks and Syrians and other strangers among them were, on the other hand, given to wondering if gentle contempt for their fellow Gentile who was rich, yet did not condescend to them, the poor, but gave them of his purse as well as of his skill. They recalled that in Christian love he was impelled to do this, but as they were human as well as Christians, it was somewhat incredible to them. The poor shared with the poor, but a rich man to do so unsettled the simple and naive and decreased their respect. Antioch was not only a city of seemingly unending heat and sun, where the black cobbled streets were as hot as fire at noon, but it was a city of walls in the Oriental manner, and secluded gardens and courtyards behind those walls, and winding roads and stinking gutters and blazing white skies, and dogs and camels and sheep and goats, loose even on the streets, accompanied by geese and doves. It was also a city of markets, even more so than Jerusalem, and the rabble here was more turbulent and blasphemous and ribald in a dozen tongues and impudent beyond endurance. It never slept at night. The night clamored with flutes and harps and zithers and drums and wild laughter and yells and shrieks and barkings, and the taverns never closed, and the roisterers roamed the street all night in garments of a score of other nations. Roman guards never walked alone. There were always 2 or 3 or 4 of them at least. The men of Antioch spat at them and cursed them, but cheerfully and in a comradely spirit. And if the Romans smiled indulgently, they were often and immediately invited to visit the nearest tavern with those who had just insulted them, and all entered with arms over shoulders. It was also as an important port on its broad river, and ships of many countries were always at anchor there, loading and unloading. "You must admit it is a colorful city, even zestful," said Barnabas, who was somewhat inclined to find mitigating features, no matter how deplorable the man, town, or the customs. "It stinks," said Saul. "I have heard it does not stink worse than Rome," said Barnabas. The Christians met in abandoned ruins on the outskirts of the city, in fields, in quarries, in barns, in miserable little houses. When Saul suggested a house of God, some of the elders, careful now of his temper, mentioned that the Lord had spoken of a temple not built of hands. That was another source of Saul's vexation. These people confused metaphor with reality. When the Lord had said that those who hunger and thirst for justice would be satisfied, that was the clear reality he had promised in the world hereafter and after his second coming. But when he spoke in mysterious parables, however simple they appeared on first hearing, and in metaphor, many were confused, and it was only the wise who could interpret to them, sometimes to their mutiny. Saul had less trouble with his fellow Christian Jews, for they were acquainted with the mysteries and the symbols of the Scriptures, and the elusive words of the prophets, which required commentators. It was the converted heathen who obstinately clung to the word and not the Spirit. The Lord, Saul would explain over and over, spoke in Aramaic, not in Greek or Latin or Syrian or Persian or Egyptian or Parthian. It was a subtle language, full of inner meanings and versatility and symbols. So he bought an old inn for the Christians, and removed walls, and made of it a temple. And with the elders he sanctified it, and set up an altar. And the women made a cloth of coarse white linen for the altar, and embroidered it lovingly. And there on the altar Saul set a fine pair of 7-branched candelabra, bought from a Jewish merchant who had sold good silver, and behind the altar was hung a tall gilt crucifix. The Christians were at first doubtful and then proud of their temple. It had been explained to them, even before Saul, that the consecration of the bread and wine made them purely the flesh and blood of the Messiah. But many remained doubtful. Some of the elders argued, "The Lord said, 'Do this in commemoration of me.'" They brightened, "Aha!" They looked at Saul with triumph. "It is but a symbol." They swelled with pride, and they had this haughty man at last. Saul shook his great red head. "You are ready to accept symbols when you decide they are symbols. But this is a reality. The bread and the wine are indeed the substance of the Lord. When spoken in Aramaic, in which he spoke only, his words do not mean imitation or symbol. They mean a repeated truth." "That is true," said Jewish Christians, nodding their heads. This immediately provoked a noisy argument among them and their fellow Christians who did not know Aramaic, and deplorably, there was some shaking of unraised fists. Saul found humor in the situation and watched indulgently. They were good and harmless men. They would not actually strike each other, would they? When one did, he banished the man for a period of 5 days, and the others were ashamed and prayed that he would be forgiven. While Saul was an organizer and an interpreter and the high priest, Barnabas was the teacher, happy and cheerful, loving and forgiving, gentle and kind. He often averted some transgression from coming to Saul's fierce attention, and some sinner given a harsh and crushing rebuke. Sometimes, in a mood of despondency common with him, Saul would confess to Barnabas that the law of God was perfect, but it was most evident that man is not capable of following it. "Consider even me," he would say, "who have had the ineffable grace of a vision, a direct confrontation with the Messiah, and have been taught directly by him, and not through the words of men. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I do, but I do the very thing I hate. I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. For I delight in the law of God, in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law of sin, which dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, what will deliver me from this body of death?" Romans 7:15-25. "We are all sinners," said Barnabas sadly. "But we should not be sinners," cried Saul. "Alas, that I reproach these poor creatures when I am worse than they! For I was mightily blessed, and saw with my own eyes." "It is the conflict of our spirit with our flesh," Barnabas urged. "Blessed be his name." Barnabas urged, "God, blessed be his name, understands this. Our little victories are not small to him. They are blessed and great and received with love, for he knows how dearly they have cost us." "Baptism removed our inherited sin," said Barnabas. We continue to sin merrily," said Saul. That most unmerry man. But the power of his voice, the marvelous eloquence of his teachings, his intuitive understanding, his vast sincerity and passion, and the fact that he was rich and learned, finally overcame the weariness of the Christians, gathered them together in a firm and enlightened body, drove lingering superstitions from them, enhanced their love of God and man, gave them courage and zeal. They never came to give him their confidences. They were reserved for the tender Barnabas, but they trusted Saul as they did no other man, and when he urged them to go out among the heathen and bring them to the Messiah, they felt their spirits uplifted and their resolution exalted. Be just and kind and mild and loving. Speak always with honor and truth. Stand like a shining pillar in the darkness. Be honorable and temperate of speech and manner. Be joyful that others may know your joy. Avoid open or private sin. Pray always, and let your countenances speak of the miracle which our Lord has wrought in your souls. So you will draw others to you in wonder, to be enlightened and to be saved. This is an evil world. He who can point the way to peace and justice and salvation and everlasting joy and love is a messenger of good tidings, a servant of God. For he comes asking, not for money or position or favor himself. He asks only happiness for the souls of others. This alone is a stupendous request, before which all men must stand in amazement and awe, for never was it offered before. So in their labor and in their leisure, the Christians zealously proselyted as they had not proselyted before, with a fervor and a persistence which pleased even Saul. He thought of them as his children, and he as their father, and he loved them with all his heart. Even when they vexed him, which was nearly always, knowing his own imperfection, he could not endure the imperfections of others. He despised them in himself and in them. And that is the end of chapter 41. We'll be back again with 42. Have a wonderful and blessed day.